What's up, guys? It's Mark with another episode of the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, the show that gives you the tips and tools you need to make yourself stronger, faster, and harder to kill. Today, I've got a special treat, man. A guy I have wanted on this show for a long time. We're talking about civilizational collapse, what's coming next, with our guest, John Michael Greer. I haven't had John on the show before, but I have mentioned his work in previous episodes, and so it's really a treat to have this guy on. He's an amazing researcher, author, and expert on a number of subjects, one of them being civilizational collapse. So in this episode, I sit down with John Michael Greer to discuss one of the most pressing yet overlooked realities of our time, that is civilizational collapse. We're going to break down some concepts to help us navigate this, one being the myth of progress. If you've ever heard of that, you will by the time we're done. We're going to examine historical patterns of decline and outline some stages of that civilizations go through before they actually fall. So join us as Greer takes us through a journey. We're going to discuss why civilizational collapse is inevitable. It's natural. You can't avoid it. We're going to talk about the stages of decline and what they look like in real time. And then we're going to talk about how the modern world's dependence on technology and resources actually makes us more vulnerable to decline. And also, and this is probably one of the more fascinating things for me, we're going to talk about the role of myth and perception in shaping societal responses to decline. I don't care if you're the most hardened atheist, humanist, materialist, you fall prey, or maybe not prey, but you operate according to a mythical paradigm, and you may not even know it. So when it comes to religion and myth, like I said, I don't care if even the most stringent materialist has a religion, and we're going to talk about that too. That might challenge you a little bit. We're going to also, and then finally, what everybody would want to know is what are the practical steps to prepare for what's coming? How can you ease your transition into decline since you know it's inevitable? So if you're in the military, law enforcement, or you're just an average Joe who takes personal security and resilience seriously, this episode is going to challenge the way you think about stability, risk, and long-term survival strategies. So, hey, before we get into that, though, I just want to give a shout out to our premium subscribers on the Substack. I really appreciate you guys. You keep the lights on and you keep me going here. And if you would like to become a premium subscriber, you can get access to all the free episodes plus Warrior Wednesday. That is exclusive only content for members. It's less than the price of a number 2 meal at McDonald's, and it won't make you fat. It'll make you a sensuous Tyrannosaurus Rex, just like me. So give that one a consideration. Really appreciate it. All right, guys. So without further ado, pull up a chair, set of spells. As our guest, John Michael Greer, takes us through a journey through the coming apocalypse. Coming to you live or recorded live from an undisclosed location south of the Mason-Dixon line. It's all on Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, and we're starting right now. All right, and welcome back to another episode of the Pearl Snap Tactical, the show that gives you the tips and tools you need to make yourself stronger, faster, and harder to kill. And guys, I've got a doozy of an episode today. I have with me famed of song and legend, the mighty John Michael Greer, who needs no introduction, but sir, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, it's so, I've made no bones about this to you and to anyone who'll listen. I'm a huge fan of your work. And if you don't mind, for those who haven't heard, we have discussed your name before on this podcast, but if they haven't or are not familiar with your work, can you kind of give us a little background and description of what you do?
Very basically, I'm a writer by trade. I'm an independent scholar. I've avoided affiliating with any of the various universities or think tanks or much of anything, really, so that I could provide an independent view in the various fields that I study and write about. In terms of this podcast, I think probably the thing that will be of most interest to people is the writings that I've done on the future of industrial society, and particularly the fact that we're steaming head on, full speed ahead, toward the same fate that's overwhelmed every previous civilization. If you look at history, one of the things you notice is that civilizations fall. It's the most predictable thing about them. We're heading that way. I've written, 11 books about that, in various aspects of that and so on. And it's a subject of continuing research for me, and there's a lot to say about it.
Yeah. So let's just jump into it. So it's so funny. There's an account I follow on X, I guess it's called now, called Zero Hedge. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but
yeah.
I love their tagline that says, "Hey, given a long enough timeline, the survival rate drops to zero." And it's just, that's so apropos for what we're discussing here. It seems like if you kind of do a cross search of the interwebs, or just kind of look at the zeitgeist, it really does seem to be that there's two competing worldviews, and perhaps just because human beings can be kind of walk in self-contradictions, I suppose it's possible to espouse both. But it does seem...
Yes, people do. Go ahead.
It does seem that on one hand, there's this, hey, we're going to the stars and technology is our savior. It's the modern day savior, and whatever problems we have, it's going to be better for the next generation. That certainly was very apparent growing up. Although I think now that it's getting hard to look at yourself in the mirror and really, with a straight face, I think, espouse that, But then the other one is the zombie apocalypse is any day upon us. There's
we're all gonna die.
Exactly. And especially I find this in my community too, that there's just this day that we don't know when, but there's going to be this day when all of a sudden we have a collapse, either tyrannical come in, hard totalitarian, or we're going to be, a Mad Max scenario. And just studying history, it seems like neither one of those are really accurate. What do you think?
Excellent. Thank you. Because in fact, both of those are fantasies. Both of those are Hollywood fantasies. Okay, it's either Tomorrowland and we're going to the stars and or it's we're all going to die next Thursday, and and the usual Hollywood catastrophe. Crank up the special effects, skyscrapers collapsing, a Sharknado, what have you. It's always one or the other. It's always one or the other, and yet, if you look at history, those are the two rarest ways for things to go. Progress, historically speaking, is a temporary phenomenon. It is a real thing. It does happen in bursts. But here's a piece of blasphemy, and I use that term specifically because worship of, you spoke of technology as our savior. Worship of progress is the established church of the modern world. People believe in progress the way medieval peasants believed in, the wonder-working bones of Saint Swithold or something. Progress will save us.
Yeah.
And so here's the blasphemy. Progress is subject to the law of diminishing returns. Okay. At any given point, to build the next generation of technology, to make the next generation of scientific discoveries, takes more resources than the last one did. The great discoveries that made electronics possible were made with the kind of equipment that would be considered inadequate for a middle school physics classroom right now. And when you think of the fantastic amounts of resources and energy and technical skill and so on that has to go into making the next generation of computers just a little faster than the last one, the law of diminishing returns cuts in. So I don't think we have to worry about going to the stars. There are very good reasons why we're probably not even going to go to other planets for more than the very briefest of visits. But set that aside. And also set aside the oh my God, we're all going to die, the zombie apocalypse, the evil tyrant who exists purely to be an evil tyrant, the goose-stepping legions that both the demagogues of the left and the demagogues of the right like talking about all the time these days. I think it's envy, but we don't have to get into that. All of these, these hideous catastrophes that don't generally happen. I mean, look at the real catastrophes. Really god awful ones. The Black Death. Okay, you have a period of a few years where a third of the population of the world dropped dead horribly with black boils all over their bodies. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It didn't even slow down the 100 Years' War. Britain and France were fighting a war that lasted for 100 years in those days. They knew how to fight it. I mean, they took their war seriously back in the 14th century, and but they were in the middle of this war, and the Black Death came through and wiped out a third of the population. And the King of France and the King of England said, "So what? The issues that led to this war are still current," and they just kept fighting.
Wow.
Okay, so you can have god awful catastrophes, and they don't actually change that much. Okay, so bracket those two. Bracket the people who it's like watching a weather station. If you can imagine some weather show where there are two meteorologists on staff, and one of them is insisting that tomorrow is going to be sunnier than today, and the day after that is going to be sunnier still, and then it's going to be summer forever, and then it's going to be uber summer and uber summer and just get more wonderful all the time. And then the other meteorologist saying, no, the ice age begins next Wednesday and we will all freeze to death. Yeah. Okay? If you heard meteorologists like that, first of all, you'd wonder what they were on and possibly where you could get some. But you certainly wouldn't take that as adequate basis for planning. And yet that's the kind of thinking about the future that we have these days. People going either giddy-eyed utopian, progress, or it's, instant apocalypse, and we'll be huddling in burnt-out basements, clutching our remaining automatic gun, our remaining rifles and hand grenades, and nothing in between.
That's so funny. I've never heard somebody put it that way, but that is directly analogous to what's going on in the zeitgeist, and we just don't even see it. It's so I can only imagine what 100 or 1,000 years from now, what historians will look back and try to get the mindset and probably think, what were these people thinking?
People a few centuries from now are going to look back on this and say, what were they on?
Yeah.
What was going on in these people's heads when the future that was actually taking shape around them day by day, right out in public in front of God and everybody. Was the one that they were not willing to talk about, and instead they fixated on these two really improbable ones. The one that nobody will talk about, of course, is decline.
Yes. Yeah.
Not catastrophe, not progress, decline, stagnation, decline, contraction. Not a quick process.
Yes. Yes.
But and the thing is, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. Please continue.
Okay. The thing that makes this funny is that most people who have their eyes open, if you go for a walk, almost any place in the United States right now, and you have been around for more than 18 years, you will see the signs of decline all around you.
Mm-hmm.
You will see that the infrastructure is going to bits. You will see that the roads and sidewalks are not being adequately repaired. You will see that housing prices have soared out of reach of most people. You will see many more signs of poverty. You will see just generally the signs of a society in decline. Mm-hmm. It's almost impossible to miss, depending on where you are. There are areas in the country that are doing better than others.
Mm-hmm.
But I've lived now in 4 different states and traveled through many more. And wherever I go, what I see, growing up in the 60s and 70s, I remember what America was like at that time. And what I see now is a country in decline, a nation that has slid over the last half century quite a ways from its peak circa 1970.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah, this is where we are. We are in the decline. It's not a matter of people going, "Wow, do you think we're going to start declining sometime?" So we're half a century down the slope.
Yeah.
And yet nobody, and sometimes I think that's why everybody talks about the two bogus futures we've been talking about, because they don't want to admit what's actually going on in front of them, what's actually going on in their lives.
Yeah. Well, that's something that kind of triggers a thought in my mind of why
Hmm.
sometimes it's hard for people to get their head wrapped around this is because we tend to kind of, look at our ancestors as these, cave living barbarians that weren't as enlightened as we are. And
Yeah.
when people say, well, look, of course, how can you say we're not advancing? How can you say technology isn't going to solve our problems? Because look in my hand, I have within my hand the
Oh God,
power of a
yeah.
computer that I can just even within 40 years time,
Hmm.
George Lucas, who changed pop psychology through his Star Wars,
Hmm.
that I have in my hand, more powerful cameras and processing speeds that I could film,
Hmm.
what he would have dreamed to have in the palm of his hand, and plus medical
Yeah.
technology, this that. So do you think maybe people maybe aren't to blame if they're have a hard time getting their head wrapped around the fact that we're in decline with these
Well,
technological advances?
blame blame strikes me as unnecessary anyway. It's pointless. Um, but the thing that makes the religion of progress so pervasive is that we all pay attention to the things we're all taught to pay attention to the handful of things that are progressing
Mm,
and ignore the much larger number of things that are declining. Yeah, it's a cell phone argument.
mm-hmm.
Okay, that's fine. How many people remember that, when they say, wow, well, I could just look up anything on the internet? 50 years ago, you could pick up the phone and call your public library's info desk and get the information almost as quickly.
Hmm.
Information about anything. Every public library of any size had a librarian on call who was sitting right there in the reference department and could get you the most absurd amounts of information very quickly.
Hmm.
Um, we did the services that are now provided by the internet were provided in other ways. They weren't quite as quick. I grant
Mm-hmm.
you that. The flame wars took quite a bit longer when when they took place in the letters columns of monthly magazines rather than on internet forums.
Yeah.
But um, so it is true that things are moving faster now.
Yeah.
It is true that we can mess ourselves over much more quickly than we once could, and we can look like a fool on a much larger scale if should we choose to do so. Um, but
Mm.
at the same time, there's that selective attention, that fixation on the handful of technological advances that are still happening. Um, one of the examples I like to point to is cars. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
um, the automobile is an old technology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the
Yes.
automobile was the automobile as we now have it. Gasoline burning internal combustion engine, four wheels, and so on and so forth, was invented in the 1890s. That was a little while ago.
Yeah.
Um,
A little
there have
while.
been, there have been changes since then, but really, if you look anything later, anything since about the late 1950s, early 1960s, it's all cosmetic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, if
Mm-hmm.
you get behind the wheel of a classic car,
Yeah.
and it can be 75 years old, but the driving experience is certainly equal to, and in many cases, a lot better.
Mm.
Sure, you don't have all those computer stuff in there; you don't need them, and it does. That also, of course, means that you can actually repair your own car instead of having to
Yes.
shell out vast amounts of money. I mean,
Yeah.
here's a blast from the past for some listeners of my age and older. I remember the days where there were books published on how to repair VWs by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't have to be an auto mechanic. You had this book and you had a toolkit, and you could do a complete tune-up on your on
Yeah.
your minibus or your Beetle just by yourself in your own
Yeah.
garage.
Mm-hmm.
And an enormous amount of the technological advances that we've seen since then have been ways to keep people from doing that.
Yes. Yeah, that's very true.
Um,
That's very
yeah.
true.
So
Yeah.
there again, how much of our technology, how much of it has been technological advances, and how much is it just okay? How can we gimmick this up to
Right.
extract more money from people?
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd call that progress.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah,
before I'd like to kind of start going into, your model
sure.
and on
Hmm.
collapse. But before we do, and this may or may not be a helpful paradigm, so you can kind of help tease this out for us. But
Hmm.
it seems like to me, when I look and I'm studying history, it seems like there's two views of or two ways of viewing time. So
Hmm.
that seems maybe apropos to this discussion. So it seems like, until about 2000 years ago, roughly, it
Hmm.
seems like most epochs, there was an idea that time was cyclical. That
Hmm.
like if you're familiar with Mircea Eliada's work
Hmm.
of
Oh yeah.
the eternal
Oh yeah.
return. You know what I mean? That
Hmm.
that things go in cycles. That whether it's a person or civilization, that you're born, you grow into maturity, you hit the zenith of your strength, and then you begin to wait. The law of entropy, right? And that's true
Hmm.
for,
Hmm.
and that just seems like that all of society and planning and everything kind of gravitated towards that. But it
Hmm.
seems like
Hmm.
about 2000 years ago, and maybe that timeline might be accurate, but then all of a sudden it seems like there's a break where people, and coincidentally with the advent of monotheistic and universalist religions, that there's this
Hmm.
idea of a linear time, that we are
Hmm.
progressing forward to an endpoint where that will be the end of history. I mean,
Hmm.
is that, first of all, is that a fair summation? And do you think that that has a bearing on what we're about to
Oh
discuss?
yeah, yeah. Oh, it has no. It's that there's a third model of time, however, because the cyclical time is very much something you get in the older civilizations.
Mm-hmm.
You find that in Egypt, you find it in Mesopotamia, you find it in India and China, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to tribal peoples, they tend toward a concept of time that I think is probably most familiar to people from references to the native peoples of Australia, the dream time. The idea
Yeah.
that there is this other kind of time that is the real time. It's the time nothing actually changes, but that's where everything actually happened. It's at the beginning of time, it's ongoing, it's at the end of time, it's the real time. And all that happens in our world is that these things that happen in the dream time are kind of echoed in various combinations.
Mm-hmm.
And so the time we experience isn't even really quite real from that dream time perspective. So you have that. You then go to the cyclical model because, of course, once you have civilizations rising and falling, and people are looking at that and say, okay, this is not just the endless repetition of patterns from the dream time. This is something that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, we have as we get toward the beginning of the Christian era, you have a tendency to be people are terrified of that. They're looking at their own civilizations and going, "Oh crap." We're going the same way. You have writings like Hesiod. You have writings like some of the Hindu scriptures, which are talking about a cycle of decline, where you have the golden age and the silver age and the bronze age and the age of heroes and then the age of iron in which we live, and it just gets worse all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's from that people leapt to this idea of linear time. That time has a beginning, it goes through this fixed process, it reaches an end, and then everything's wonderful and nothing ever changes again.
Mm-hmm.
Which is the sort of core model of Christian history,
Yeah.
also of most of the monotheisms. And then you end up with that being hijacked in the 16th century, with the 16th, 17th century, with the rise of modern science, of modern scientific materialism, the idea that yes, history is a straight line and it's taking us to bigger and better things all the time, and so we have this weird sort of distortion of the older Christian version where there is no end point. There is no second coming followed by the millennium, followed by nothing ever changes ever again. You have this onward and upward forever belief, which is really quite strange in human history.
Yeah.
It's not something you find. I don't know of another society that ever believed in it.
Yeah.
And yet, as we've talked, it's hardwired into the belief system of the modern world.
Yeah.
And it leads us to make a lot of really stupid mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask you kind of to talk about your theory of collapse in general, and then we'll get to more into specifics. But
sure.
Do you what is the implication then of viewing time and through those lenses? I mean, is that relevant for our discussion? What we're going to get into as far as helping to understand this?
I would say it's not really, because history is complex. Anytime you try to flatten out the complexities of history into some simple geometrical model, like a straight line or a circle, or or any of these, you're oversimplifying.
Right.
And so, no, I would argue that it is the case that civilizations tend to fall according to similar patterns, but it's not identical. I mean, I've seen
Right.
people
Yeah.
literally going through Roman history, the history of the Roman Empire,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to do a year by year, date by date comparison with our history and try to predict our future,
Yeah.
depending on which emperor we supposedly have in the imperial palace right now.
Yeah.
Emperor Trumpus the First or something like that. But
So if I could, I
but
might, if
go
it's
ahead.
okay, I might push back a little bit. At least,
Sure.
maybe you can help me work out my own paradigm. But like for me, once I kind of got my head grasping around a cyclical view of time,
Mm-hmm.
I do agree with you. Like, there's no use in trying to find a repeat patterns, a match for match, and saying, it's such and such date, this is going to
Mm-hmm.
collapse, and this will give birth to this. But it did seem to help take the pressure off of me when I
Mm-hmm.
see myself in decline, or our society in decline, instead of freaking out about it, or saying,
Uh-huh.
oh, it's because we're so decadent, or we're doing this, to come to, to not wrestle with it any more than I would grasping with my
Mm-hmm.
own mortality and old age, to
Mm-hmm.
say, hey, this is
Mm-hmm.
natural. And instead of fighting
Mm-hmm.
it in the sense of resistance,
Okay.
I just need to make the decision, just like with my own age, how am I
Mm-hmm.
going to go into elderhood? How am I
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
the next phase? So for me,
Actually,
what do you think of
actually,
that?
that's using the model of the human lifespan is a very useful one,
Mm,
because you don't know how long you're going to live.
right. Yeah.
We none of us know. Any of us could live. We could croak today,
Mm-hmm.
or we could live to the age of 120. Some people do, and some of
Yeah.
them don't actually, take good care of themselves. I'm thinking of one old lady who was, whose health regimen was smoking a pack of cigarettes a day and drinking local whiskey. It seemed to do her pretty well. I think she got to 119.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, you don't know. So
Yeah.
it's not a cycle in the sense of a clock or with divisions marked out on, but you know that there's a rise for any of these. There's a rise and then there's a fall. There's a peak and a valley. You know where it's headed. You
Mm-hmm.
don't know when,
Right.
and so that metaphor to my mind is loose enough and
Mm-hmm.
flexible enough that it works fairly well.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and our civilization is about the usual age to be hitting decline,
Yeah.
and if I may risk being political for a moment, the United States is one of the oldest um, nations in the world in terms of its current constitution.
Hmm.
Very, very, very few nations, are still being governed by the same system of laws, the same legal structure, and so on. After we're getting on for our 250th anniversary.
Mm-hmm.
That's extremely rare. Iceland is one of the, Iceland has had their basic structure in place for a long time. England's the great, is the real geriatric nation right now.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the others, most countries on Earth have had at least one new governmental system put in place in the 20th century.
Do you have
Some of them
any
had,
guesses as to
yeah.
why maybe America has seemed to last so long?
Well, to start with, we actually have a very flexible system.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. Constitution has its problems, like anything human, but it's a very flexible, very relatively stable system. It's a system that can allow change without anybody having to storm the barricades or die like flies on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It is a system where we can where it's not necessarily easy to make change, but change can happen. Dramatic change can happen in this country without a need for overthrowing the government.
Hmm.
And that's a strength that many countries don't have. It's something the English parliamentary system can do that. They've been through their share of revolution of non bloody revolutions as well.
Mm-hmm.
Many other governmental systems have not been as flexible as that, and some of them are extremely brittle.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's I think we have a good constitutional structure, and I think that's most of it.
Hmm. That's interesting.
You know,
Well, let's
as long as we can hold on to it.
yeah, yeah, it's a yeah. Um, so let's kind of go further into this. So
Hmm.
we're talking civilizational
We're talking
collapse.
civilization.
What does that mean? What does that phrase mean to you? And what are your theories
Okay.
of like what that model looks like for us?
Okay. Just so let's start with an overview, and we can take the example that comes first to. Well, isn't it the running joke now that how many times a day do you think about the Roman Empire?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we can talk. We can think about the Roman Empire for a moment.
Okay.
Um, in 300 A.D., the city of Rome was the capital of the western half of Eurasia. It was it was a city of a couple of million people.
Mm-hmm.
It was this big, powerful center of a center of trade, a center of commerce, a center of political and military power, a center of culture and literature and everything. It was big, it was booming, it was thriving. In 800 AD, that same city, 500 years later, um, was an impoverished small town where goats pastured in what had been the forum and these big
Mm-hmm.
centers of power. That's collapse.
Yeah.
If you go, if you go to Rome even today, you can see the remains of some of these huge old imperial buildings, and you realize these things. Rome was able to achieve all this, and then down it went
Yes.
until Rome was a tiny little city-state, basically run by the popes,
Mm-hmm.
and most of the people there got by farming, making little fields in what had previously been the locations of apartment blocks. They had 10, 12-story apartment buildings in Rome.
Mm.
In
Wow.
ancient Rome,
Yeah.
it was we think of it as very modern. They had flush toilets.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
they had taxi cabs with odometers, and they'd bill you by the equivalent of the mile. Now the taxi cabs were pulled by horses, of course, but the
Mm-hmm.
principle's there.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
how many horsepower do you have? Well, there are 1, 2 horses. There you go. Um,
Literally. Yeah.
Literally, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So when we're talking about collapse, we are talking about a drastic decline in social complexity, in population, in wealth, in the ability to do or even to build or maintain things, in technology, just across the board. So the whole range of potential of social complexity goes from a higher level to a much lower level.
Mm.
And one thing that I do want to note the population issue here. People in my generation all grew up hearing of the population bomb, and we all watched Soylent Green and movies like that to assume the population would keep growing and growing and growing. I think some people are starting to catch on to the fact that population is leveling out on this planet right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's just about breaking even now, and it is beginning because fertility rates are dropping so steadily.
Yeah.
We've probably reached peak human population right now. Every continent but Africa has negative population growth, and Africa is dropping like a rock. So,
Yes.
we're looking. We can talk about that because that has economic consequences that most people are completely unprepared for.
Yeah. I've been
But
reading
so
a little.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sorry. I've been reading a little bit about that, and that just your population growth or decline in and of
Hmm.
itself could be a reason for your collapse. And
Yeah, it's the single largest factor behind economic growth and decline, and so yeah. But so imagine a situation where the United States has 5% of its current population. We have what? What's the current U.S. population? 340 million, something like that.
I'm not sure.
Um,
I'll take your word on that.
yeah, but something like
Yeah.
that. And imagine it dropping to 5% of that. Imagine we'll say it's 350 just for round numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, 350 million. So imagine it going down to like 15 or 18 million people in the entire United States,
Wow. Yeah.
where a city like New York has 100,000 people in it.
Mm-hmm.
Except it's not one city anymore. It's a bunch of little communities that mostly make their living by tearing down dead skyscrapers and selling the metal.
Mm. Yeah.
Imagine a future in which subsistence farming is the normal way of making a living. 90% of the people are, they've got a plow, and it's probably drawn by a horse or
Yeah.
an ox.
Yeah.
and 90% of the people are making their living on the land in the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
A time when there may well be still a few airplanes.
Mm.
There won't be many cars, because cars aren't worth much when you don't have roads to drive them on, and vast amounts of fossil fuels coming across the country in pipelines and tanker cars and everything. But you have a few airplanes, you have a few other motorized things, maybe a train or two in areas that have been able to maintain that. Maybe electricity in a few towns where there's a hydroelectric dam. But most people are living what we would consider an 18th century lifestyle, because that's the technology they can afford.
Right.
And
right.
And there are whole sections of the country, counties, that have nobody living in them. Very large sections of the web. I mean, right now there's a lot of the high plains where there are lots and lots of abandoned towns, and imagine that extending. And it's a very different world, and it's one that most people don't tend to think about. That's what I'm seeing in terms of decline. Not zombie apocalypse, but just imagine this unfolding not over a short period, over the next 200 years. Imagine basically that from our current state, each year brings a little bit of contraction, a little fewer people, a little less wealth, a little less economic activity, year after year after year, until your great-grandchildren are living in a world that you wouldn't recognize, but that people in 1850 would probably find very, very comfortable.
Yeah, it's really interesting too when you phrase it like that, it's conceivable to see, well, we're going through it now, but that, as the generations, like once we leave our time here on Earth, and, our children and our grandchildren, that, the people going through this process, it will seem very normal. They won't even recognize it, because they will have grown up with it.
That's something else you see in writings from the late Roman Empire. In like the 5th century, when decline was just overwhelming, nobody seemed to notice. It was just business as usual. It's just that's how things are.
Yeah.
And so when in 2250 or whatever, when where I am now in New England has become, a patchwork of little farming towns and a few mill towns where there's still water power. And you turn an ear and you'll hear the clip clop of hooves pulling a carriage down the street. Nobody's going to think of that as anything weird. They will know that it was different, 200 years previously, because they've read about that in a book.
Right.
And but just as we know that 200 years ago things were different, but it won't matter to them the way that so many people think it should. It won't, because they'll have gotten rid of this mythology of progress that we're taught to believe in. They'll have to.
They'll have a totally different orientation to the world that we just take for granted. Like you said, it's so ingrained in the DNA almost at this point, but just by force of nature and necessity, that those mind shifts will change because they'll have to.
Well, faith in progress is already breaking down. You're already starting to see people asking the hard questions, and even simply going, why can't we just have something that works instead of something that's new? And you're starting to get the process that in one of my books I term retrovation, innovation by going back. Looking at, how did they do this in 1950? Because guess what? It was cheaper and more reliable than how we're doing it now. And so I see that as one of the great waves of the future. More blasphemy against the great God of progress, I know, but there it is.
I know. You better watch it. You're going to get burnt at a digital stake.
It's happened. I have to moderate my blogs very carefully, because drive-by flamings are exceedingly common there.
So now that we've kind of defined what civilizational collapse is, and as far as the way you look at it through your research, like,
Mhm.
and you may have already mentioned this, so forgive me if we're just kind of covering ground, but that we've already tread. But like, how would you? Are there stages? What? And you kind of
Oh
talked
yeah.
about that a little bit, but how do
No,
you
no.
look at this?
How do I look at it? What we are looking at right now is it literally right at the present time is a transition between two of those stages. And the first of those stages I have called abundance industrialism. Okay. It's an industrial economy where the big problem is how do you use all these resources? How do you use all this abundance? How do you put everything to work? And
Hmm.
that's the economy of growth that we all grew up believing was normal. That's abundance industrialism. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do if you've got a continent that's brimful of cheap, readily available natural resources, if you've got an expanding labor force, if you've got all these other things that we had when the United States started industrializing, 200 years ago.
Hmm.
And the problem is we don't have those anymore.
Mm.
I mean, I appreciate Donald Trump going, the whole drill baby drill business, but
Yeah.
he's going to find out, as so many people have found out before him, that there's, there's only so much petroleum in the ground.
Hmm.
And yes, I can hear virtually right now some of our listeners going, yeah, but what about abiotic oil theory? Well,
Yeah.
yeah, very well. We could talk about that too. The fact of the matter is that it's been tested and it's not true.
Mm.
But
Mm.
to the extent that oil does generate within the earth, and it does, of course, under either theory, whether biotic or abiotic, it does so very, very slowly. And if you want to wait around, 50 million years, that's fine.
Yeah.
There will be plenty of oil then. But I think that's mostly going to be interesting to the distant descendants of chipmunks who will have
Yeah.
replaced us by then, or raccoons. Actually, probably.
Yeah.
I figure raccoons are likely to be the next intelligent species on this planet.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Yes, the mighty
or-
empire of the trash pandas. I can
yeah,
see
I
it
was
now.
I was just going to say, as we call them down here, trash pandas.
Trash
But
pan. That term has spread. I've heard that
yeah.
here in New England too.
Oh.
So yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah. The mighty empire of the trash pandas will have plenty of oil, but that's 50 million years from now. I don't think our economy can wait.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with fewer resources. We're dealing with a contracting labor force. We're dealing with a lot of infrastructure that all has to be maintained, and that sucks up an enormous amount of resources and money and labor and everything else.
Mm.
And that pushes us over the line from abundance industrialism to scarcity industrialism.
Mm.
And scarcity industrialism is what it sounds like. You still have an industrial system. You're still having factories turning out products, but the scramble is to keep them fed, to keep the oil flowing, the natural gas flowing, the coal flowing, the an adequately trained labor force coming in the doors, adequately paid labor force, the electricity still moving, the raw materials. It becomes an increasing problem as you go on, and that's the transition we're going through now. Right now, it's still fairly easy, more
Hmm.
or less.
Hmm.
As we go year after year, it's going to become harder and harder, and that finally leads to the transition from scarcity industrialism to the salvage economy. That's the wrenching one, because that's the point at which you can no longer maintain an industrial economy at all. You have to downshift to local craftspeople. You have to downshift toward subsistence economy. And at
Hmm.
that point, the single largest form of wealth is salvage. At that point, that skyscraper stops being a place to have a business. It becomes a source of raw materials. You tear that puppy down.
Hmm.
Every I-beam becomes a source of iron. Every piece
Yeah.
of copper wire, copper's expensive. Let's strip
Hmm.
that fast.
Yeah.
Literally everything in there. That's when we'll see people literally going into the old landfills with shovels.
Mm. Hmm.
That's there's gold in them there
Yeah.
trash. Well, there may not be gold, but there's metal, and there may be and then glass that can be used, and all kinds of other useful things. Isn't it sweet that the ancients stored this stuff up for us?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay?
So
And yeah.
I've been to Rome and around for
Uh-huh.
a couple
Oh yeah.
times. And
Yeah,
in
yeah.
fact, I just went there this last summer, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, just looking at the Colosseum, you can see where it's been scavenged. They were pulling stone. They were pulling
Oh yeah,
like
yeah.
the metal I beams out of that
Oh
um
yeah. Yeah.
to for construction, that it just be, it's
Exactly.
a wonder
It's
they didn't turn it into a rubble pile.
Yeah, well, the Romans knew. There's one of the little challenges for the believers in progress. Roman concrete is better than anything we can build, and nobody knows why.
Yeah.
They had tricks for making concrete that we don't understand, and that's why their concrete structures, the brick-faced or stone-faced concrete structures, they're still doing fine after 2,000 years. Our concrete, not so much.
Yeah, there's
So
there's
yeah,
still
yeah.
bridges that are like 2,000 years old in Rome that are
Oh
still
yeah.
being used. I walk
Oh
down,
yeah.
as you're going to the Forum, there's this
Hmm.
walkway that goes down, and my understanding from what I was told is that pretty much every emperor from Julius Caesar to, I guess, maybe even Marcus Aurelius, or at least
Hmm.
into the late Republic, that had tread
Hmm.
that on the day of their coronation. And I
Yeah,
mean,
you're
that road
those
looks
those
better than
stones. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that road was in better shape than the roads in my subdivision, and my subdivision isn't
Uh-huh.
that old.
Yeah, that's just it. So we move into scarcity industrialism, and that continues until the survival salvage runs out.
Mm,
And at that point, you transition into the final fully subsistent stage, which at which point the decline bottoms out. You end up in your society in what we can call quite reasonably a dark age society,
yeah,
and that's where you bottom out, and then you begin climbing the slope to the next civilization.
yeah.
So
Where
it's not hopeless by any means, but we have a long ways to go before that happens.
yeah, so yeah, and then we get to the stage where the barbarians become warlords and become the
Hmm.
new nobility and aristocracy, and it starts all over again.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. One of the other patterns that you see there is the corruption of economics, and that's actually what leads to the warlords.
Mhm.
Most people don't, who don't really get deep into Roman history, don't realize that those barbarian warlords showed up, what happened was a significant improvement of the quality of life for most people,
Hmm.
because supporting the imperial Roman bureaucracy was a fantastic tax burden. Does this
Right.
sound familiar?
Yes.
Okay. It was literally driving many, many people into a state of total economic collapse.
Hmm.
Okay. To the point that the Roman government passed laws, and this may also seem familiar, which required people to go into the same jobs their fathers had, even if they couldn't make a living at it.
Mm. Mm.
Because we have to have X number of people doing this, and so we're going to have our government bureaucrats tell you what you're going to do for a living.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what happens, of course, is that Alaric the Visigoth comes through, or Alaric's third cousin, and grabs a chunk of former Roman territory with a couple of cities and some towns and so on, and says, "This is now my kingdom." Okay.
Mm.
And you're going to have to pay this X amount of tribute to keep me happy as a king. And it's about 10% of what it costs to support the bureaucrats. And
Mm.
so this is why the barbarians were so successful. Alaric's third cousin, everyone's going, "Yay, yay, King!" Whatever his name was.
Hmm.
Hail King Genseric, who cut our taxes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for
And
sure.
so, yeah, and that's a huge factor. It is simply so much cheaper to support a barbarian warlord than it is to support an imperial bureaucracy. And that's you can see that as an aspect of decline and contraction, but for most people, it's an improvement.
Mm. Yeah, it's such a sad thing, but I think it's just the fate of all empires. When you look at Rome in the early
Uh-huh.
Republic age, when they're engaged in expansion and the Punic Wars, where they're
Mm-hmm.
raising up these legions, and it's the citizenry that is willing to step up and die for the idea
Uh-huh.
of Rome. This great
Mm-hmm.
vision, and then you get to the last stages of the empire, and they're having to hire mercenaries and barbarians on the
Because
frontiers because the
yeah,
citizenry is like, why bother? I mean, these
yeah,
people are taxing me to death.
what on earth do we have to gain from this? It's just a matter of who's going to rip us off now.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And it's like,
and Yeah.
if this is what it means to be a citizen, then I'd rather be a barbarian, and
Yeah, exactly. Hail King Genseric. He cut our
yeah,
taxes. Exactly.
and
Yeah.
you really see that, obviously not articulated in the same way, but you definitely see that
Hmm.
in the zeitgeist, with a lot of
Oh, yeah.
people, because of course we just had an election, so there's a certain side that, of renewed vigor and optimism, but prior
Hmm.
to that, you really do see,
Hmm.
you see people leaving the military, they're
Oh, yeah.
leaving law enforcement, they're like, what is the point, what am I defending, what I mean? I'm just
What am I defending? Yeah. No,
enriching,
the current, yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, the current situation is actually a great example because this is something that happens quite routinely during a period of imperial contraction. You get to a point where the system is so gimmicked, so corrupt, so kleptocratic, so dysfunctional for most of its citizens that they start going, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
And then at that point, very often you get somebody who comes into power from more or less outside. And takes power and clears away some of the damage and improves things for a while.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would compare Donald Trump to Marcus Aurelius. I would have a hard time thinking of two men who are more different, but they have similar historical roles. And so, we can expect several rounds of this over the next century or two, where I'm talking Emperor Trumpus the First, where you have some new president coming in, some new administration coming in, various corrupt officials being thrown out, various systems for bilking the public out of wealth being shut down, at least for a while, and it helps for a while.
Yeah.
It doesn't prevent the process, but it can make it a lot easier for ordinary people over the course of the decades after any of these sort of efforts at revival.
Yeah.
And so we can expect. I think we can expect a number of these as we go, and of course they will be fought tooth and nail. Some of the would-be reformers will doubtless be assassinated stabbed in the forum, along similar lines as it's a messy. The fall of a civilization is a messy business.
Yeah.
But this is a normal part of the process. Another thing which actually ties very much into this is the corruption of the economic system, where the money system becomes a way of extracting wealth. And very often this takes the form of inflation. In Roman times, when currency was all in the form of coins, precious metal coins, you debased the currency. You cut the you cut the gold in your gold sesterces with various cheaper forms of metal, and so people would test it and say, okay, this is only worth half a sesterce, and away we go. We have more efficient means of inflation these days, but it amounts to the same thing. And what it turns into is what's going on, of course, is that people are coming up with various ways to game the system, to extract wealth from it without producing anything of value.
Right.
And what this leads to is more and more people dropping out of the market economy. Our economists tend to forget that market economies are not universal. They're not necessary. It is entirely possible to run a whole society without having the exchange in the free markets. You can do it. I mean, the Middle Ages is a great example. During the early Middle Ages, the average person could go for their entire lives without once seeing a coin. Coins were these weird things you heard about. There was a chest of coins in the dragon's hoard after Beowulf slew the dragon.
Yeah.
Okay, wow, how exotic coins. Yeah, but in fact, the economies in those days were customary. It was largely based on labor and grain. Your rent for say you are a yeoman, let's say you are a farmer. Your rent for the land that you work is to give 10% of the grain that you grow to the local baron. And you also need to provide him with 3 suckling pigs at Christmas each year.
Yeah,
that's the kind of thing. And and for 2 weeks every year you have to work on castle repair.
Right. Yeah.
And that's your rent.
Yeah.
And that's the same rent that your great grandfather paid, and it's the same rent that your great grandson will pay. And between that and a few other simple customary exchanges, gift economies, things like that. And the whole point of it is to get out from under money, to get out from under the system when it's being gamed, as as it is now.
Yeah.
As a way of for people to profit at your expense, profit off the actual production of goods and services, to profit off that without contributing anything to the economy.
Yeah.
So that's another thing. That's a thing to watch very closely, and it has consequences that we'll want to watch.
So we've painted a somewhat bleak picture of the future, albeit a natural one, but and an honest one. But before we I want to let the listeners get your take on, well, how do we navigate this? How do we go in? But before we do that, there's one last little thing I want to ask you about, and that is the tech bros, the Silicon Valley types, and the transhumanists. So, I kind of learned about this, I don't know, within the last few years, because I really, it just wasn't on my radar. But these transhumanist folks that are really the epitome of the postmodern philosophy that, that we rebel against everything. And the last thing to rebel against is nature. So we're going to, we're you know what I mean? It's like, to me, that is what I know. The postmodernism is about. Like, we're no longer nature's not going to dictate what's a man, what's a woman, and now we're getting into nature is not going to dictate to us what is a human being. And so now we're looking at these folks that want to put a chip in your head. They think that in time we'll be able, obviously just for the rich and the we'll be able to upload their consciousness into a computer mainframe, which I can't get my computer to talk to my printer half the time. There's no way in hell I'm going to upload my consciousness into one. So, but
no,
when are these people going to get it?
Okay, when are they going to get it? That depends on what you want them to get. In terms of when they're going to get a clue, they won't.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a saying in the academic world that science proceeds by heart attacks. Okay, when the old generation of scientists who cling to an outmoded theory finally die, the new theory takes its place. Okay, that's what we're seeing there. But think about these transhumanists, though. They think they're being original. They think they're being like shocking and cutting edge and coming up with new ideas. Every single one of those ideas was already old hat 100 years ago in pulp science fiction. Every single one of them. And if you look at what they're saying, you realize that what they're saying is actually fundamentalist Protestant Christianity seen through a kind of weird tech bro filter. Okay, they expect these super intelligent AIs to save them. That's their equivalent of Jesus. Yes. They expect to upload their consciousness into robot bodies. Those are the glorified bodies of the elect that we're all supposed to get after the second coming, right? We're going to go to the space. That's their equivalent of heaven. Blah, blah. It's all just a rehash of ideas that they ripped off from the local Southern Baptist church.
Yeah.
And then rewrote in the language of bad science fiction. Yeah. But I think, there's no, every time they've tried to do this exciting new thing, you recall Second Life, that was supposed to revolutionize the world. The Google Glasses, we've had we're in the middle of this big rollout of what is mistakenly called artificial intelligence and might better be called artificial stupidity. And it's all they're all stuck trying to fulfill a set of fantasies about the future that were fixed in place by a bunch of teenage boys in the 1920s reading cheap pulp magazines with pictures of underdressed women on the cover.
Yeah.
It has not changed a bit since. That's one of the reasons that one of the things I point to when I say, no, we're in decline. And one of the things that shows us in our decline is we can't even imagine a new future anymore. As a society, we've lost the capacity to imagine something actually new. It's all 1930s rehash. It's all, I mean, I still get people waiting onto my blog sometimes, insisting, pulling ideas out of Star Trek.
You're
That's
right.
kind of the black hole where the modern imagination goes to die.
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek originally premiered in 1965?
Yeah. Yeah.
When cars had tail fins? When
Yeah.
Surfer Girl was a hit? We're talking, and this is their idea of an exciting new future?
Mm. Mm.
Come on.
Yeah.
This is geriatric. This is senile.
Yeah.
That future needs to be settled comfortably in a nursing home, and yet it's the only thing. That's the only future people can imagine, and that, I think, shows the collapse of that forward momentum that the believers in progress is so fixated on.
Yeah, it seems that whether you are a spiritual person or just a hardcore materialist, it just seems like human beings cannot do without their myths and religion in some form.
Oh yeah. No, if people get rid of a religion, what that means is they've embraced some other ideology that counts as a religion.
Yeah.
It's an ersatz religion, and you just have to figure out what is the equivalent of God. And you understand that, and so in faith in progress, the transhumanists, progress is their God. It's like Marxists, historical materialism is their God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's all the same thing. It's simply a religious belief with the serial numbers filed off.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. So to try to obscure and hide it, but it's still there.
To try to, but and the thing is, this happens in every civilization. Mm-hmm. Every civilization has its age of reason. Every civilization has its period where it has these exciting intellectuals who decide they're finished with religion. We're going to be all rational and so on, and they proceed to come up with ideologies that are identical to their former religion, except again with the serial numbers carefully filed off. It happened among the Greeks and Romans. It happened in ancient India and China. It's a universal, and we're approaching the end of that at this point, and it also always has an end.
Yeah. Huh. Well, let's transition into what I know other people are going to at this point be dying. It's like, okay, you told me the future sucks. What do I do?
No. The thing is, the future doesn't have to suck at all. That's the thing about an era of contraction and decline as opposed to catastrophe. Okay? Mm-hmm. If you navigate it well, you can have a perfectly happy life. All you have to do is not depend on progress. Okay. There was kind of a catchphrase that sprung up in my blog for a while that people used all the time, which is collapse now and avoid the rush. Okay, collapse now and avoid the rush. It's very simple. If you know where things are headed more or less, and you can get there ahead of the crowd, you're going to be sitting pretty. And this actually works even in fairly serious situations. There were people I knew who were, who did this just before the great financial crash, and who did it just before, in the years leading up to the whole COVID business, where they looked at their lifestyles, figured out the gap between how they were trying to live and what they could actually afford, pulled things in a little bit, got their finances in order, got their lives in order, make sure they could provide themselves with the things they desperately needed, with everything they needed. They were fine. And then crisis hit and they sailed right through it.
Yeah.
If you own your own home, or if you rather than having it, renting it from a bank via mortgage, or if you rent someplace that's cheaper than you could afford if you really stretch things, if you have some flexibility in your budget, if you have multiple skill sets, so that if one job goes away, you can leap to another one readily, and so on and so forth. There's a range of things you can do, and if you do that, decline is nothing to worry about. Decline is something you can just skate on with. It's to swap sports. It's you're surfing the wave.
Yeah.
Okay, and you just have to know how to surf the wave, and you can have a grand time at it. I had kind of a secret advantage here. As a writer, the old stereotype that writers start out very poor, living in garrets on rice and beans and so on. It's quite true. You don't actually start making a significant living as a writer until you've got a decent backlist of books you've already published that are bringing in more money every year. And so one of the advantages that I and my late wife had is that we both grew up in families that were not very well off.
Right.
And so we were able to learn how to be poor intelligently, learn how not to waste our money, how to budget and manage things, how to stay well within our means, and we did just fine. There would be economic crisis. I mean, we had an interesting habit of being in ground zero for various economic crises. I mean, I lived in Seattle during the .com bust.
Yeah.
I've lived in Southern Oregon in a major real estate hotspot during the real estate bust. I knew people who were destroyed by both of those. I know one guy who killed himself because he was so deep in debt as a result of his own idiotic actions. And I didn't do anything like that.
Yeah.
I played it safe. I was careful and comfortable, and did just fine. Oh, with regard to economics, I'm going to give your listeners a free secret weapon. Which will keep them safe from speculative bubbles of all kinds and teach them more about how to stay out of the market at the wrong time than anything else in existence. It is a book by John Kenneth Galbraith. It is titled The Great Crash 1929. Get it, read it. It is the funniest, wittiest, most side-splitting work of serious economic history you'll ever read. And once you read it, you will instantly recognize every speculative bubble and back away from it.
Interesting. That's great. I'll definitely get it.
It's great. It's great. Read The Great Crash 1921 by John Kenneth Galbraith. Get that book, treasure it. I reread it every 2 years or so just to keep everything fresh because he does a brilliant job of anatomizing not only how speculative bubbles work, how they pop, how the crash works out, but the rhetoric. And it's always the same rhetoric.
Same script.
1929. It's right off the script. It's always this a new era. The old rules don't count. Changes in technology, the advances in technology have really changed things. And so and we really haven't factored in all the additional wealth this technology has. It's all the same.
Yeah. So if I can sum up some of your points, so we're going into decline. It's unavoidable. It's a fact of nature, really. It's baked into the cake. And so what we need to do is as we transition to more, smaller based organic kind of types of economies, that's where skills become important. Living frugally, cutting back your dependency on the technology. Not that you have to live in a cave, but to start trying to cut back where you can and to build skills, because those are the things that are currency. In an interchangeable,
and that skills are the things that most people don't have right now. I know a lot of people who are into prepping. I know a lot of people who have gold stashed away or what have you. But I know very few have taken the time to learn skills that will actually that they could use to if as the global economy, the economy of funny money and abstract IOUs starts coming unglued. What's going to be needed is people who can perform skilled labor or to meet the needs of other people.
Yeah.
If you are a competent plumber, if you are a competent electrician, if you can brew good beer, I promise you, if Attila the Hun comes riding up to your door and you can hand him a cold one and say, "Here you go," you've got a friend.
Yeah, I think you just turned the lights on for a lot of people out there right now.
Yeah, exactly. If you can brew good beer, if the ladies among us, depending on who does the baking in your household, can bake decent bread.
Yeah.
Not this sort of foam rubber wonder crap that we're that we're fed these days, but an actual tasty loaf of bread, please. There are all these skills. And people. You mentioned the whole back to the caves business. What I want to see people do is back to the 1950s. Okay.
Yeah.
I was not around in the 1950s, but I know people who were, and I am quite certain that very few people lived in caves in the 1950s.
Right. You're right.
Very few people, planted vegetables by digging in the dirt with a stick.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
there were very few jobs for mammoth hunters in those days. But yeah, so back to the 1950s gives us a technological horizon, a level of technology, a level of available skills, modes of exchange, modes of doing things, which are still very acceptable, very accessible right now. You can go onto archive.org and go to the advanced search function, choose the skill set you want, and do a search for textbooks from 1900 and 1950. And download a couple of dozen, school textbooks from the old trade schools on how to do, you name it. Okay, learn that stuff. Get your basement shop going, or get your kitchen, get busy in your kitchen, get going in your garden, whatever skill you're trying to work on.
Yeah.
Okay. Learn those skills, get good at them. You will be sitting so pretty.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's sage advice and that's something that people can do, and they don't have to break the bank to do it. You don't have to store 10,000 cases of tuna fish in your basement and buy an Abrams tank. You can just start learning these skills, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, I mean, if you really want an Abrams tank, if that's your passion in life, don't let me stop you. But it's not going to do you that good, much good.
Yeah.
It's and the other really great thing about skills, okay, most of your preparations you can't talk about. If you talk, I mean, don't be a moron. If you talk about the fact that you have gold or other precious things, you're just setting you up for armed thieves.
Yes.
Some of whom may have government, may be working for a government down the road.
Yeah.
If you talk about how you have lots of food in the basement, you're also setting yourself up for various kind of trouble.
Yeah.
If you let people know that you brew good beer and hand out some bottles now and again, as the economy winds down and people want a cold one, they know who to talk to, and they're going to talk because you got the skill. It's like there's a meme going around these days, which shows an egg carton, and it says on it, and then all of a sudden everyone wanted to be friends with a crazy chicken lady.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You see exactly if you know how to keep chickens and you've got a dozen hens in the backyard happily turning out eggs, everybody on your street is your friend. That's how you build post-market economies. That's how you build connections and communities, by having those skills, and you can be as public about them as the day is long.
Yes.
The other thing, back to the 1950s, is one thing. The other thing to do, if there aren't many people these days around anymore. There were when I was younger who lived through the Great Depression, but there's still books about it, and you can find out. Okay, how did people get by? How did people thrive during the Great Depression? A lot of people did. One thing that many people don't know is that musicians did surprisingly well. There wasn't a lot of other entertainment. So out in rural areas, okay, every Saturday they'd have a dance at the Grange Hall. And they would have a potluck dinner for everybody. Everybody would bring whatever dish they could, and then they'd get some musicians, and musicians would get some cash, and would also get full bellies, because they'd play for the dance. And there were people who did the rounds,
right?
And musicians who just traveled from Grange Hall to Grange Hall, or the equivalent in urban areas. If you were in New York City at the time, if you were a decent jazz musician, you did not have to worry about where your meals were coming from. There were people who would, they wanted to dance, they wanted to party. It was hard times. They couldn't afford much, but they could certainly, bring a pot of stew. So just look into how people have gotten through hard times in the past. Figure out which of those skills you can learn and get good at. Get to work.
Yeah, it's a choose your own adventure kind of thing, right?
Yeah, and and very much so, because don't do exactly the same things everyone else. Obviously, if everyone on the street already knows how to brew beer, that's probably not your best bet.
Right.
So choose the odd thing that interests you. My late wife, her maternal grandfather was he was from Wales. He spoke fluent Welsh, and he was a Baptist preacher. And they lived in upstate New York at that time, and he traveled all through the Welsh communities in upstate New York and Pennsylvania and areas nearby. Every Sunday, he'd be at a different church preaching sermons in Welsh. And that was one of the major things that got them through the Great Depression.
Wow.
Not a common skill, but there was a market for it. And everyone could come up with, the congregations would come up with some money for gas and some money for the family and plenty of food and a good meal and this kind of stuff. So you can get by that way.
Yeah.
So, look at what might work for you. Look at what people actually want and need alongside that tall, cold bottle of beer.
Yeah.
And see what you can do.
Yeah. Fantastic. John, we've got just a few minutes left. I'm going to, of course, let you plug any new book and, of course, your website and how people can find you if they want to learn more. But are there any new projects or anything you've got on the books that you want to share or anything you're working on right now?
Right at the moment, I'm kind of between future history projects. I've been looking at a range of things. Basically, one thing I need to watch is what's going to happen with regard to the new administration in D.C. How is that all going to play out? Because that could have a lot of impact on the next 20 years of America's history.
Yeah.
And so I do have a novel recently out, which is actually I suppose you have to call it science fiction. It's set in the future, in a future of decline. The title is The Hall of Homeless Gods. And that actually makes sense within the context of the story, because there are a lot of refugees in Japan. But yeah, The Hall of Homeless Gods, it is readily available, and I think it might be of interest to these readers. There's a fair amount of gunplay in it, among other things.
Oh, wow. All right. Hey, you just perked my attention up.
there we go. Yeah. The main character is very fond of his Colt 1911.
Well, yeah, that's one thing. One reason why I'm just such a big fan, John, is just the number of topics and the things that you can speak on, from politics and philosophy to futurism to history and religion. And it's just really amazing. You really are a treasure, sir. And I'm just honored to make your acquaintance. And I hope you will. I hope you had a good experience here, and we'll come back and talk to us again.
I've enjoyed myself. So yeah, let's plan on it.
Well, good. Well, before we go, John, where's the best place that someone can find you if they want to learn more about your work?
Okay, they want to go to www.ecosophia.net, ECOSOPHIA.net, or ecosophia.dreamwidth.org is my Dreamwidth journal. Those are the two places. If you shop on Bookshop, which is an alternative to the Big Slimy River place, there's if you look up my name, John Michael Greer, you'll find my bookshop there also. But yeah, or your favorite full service bookstore, on or offline.
And you're also on X, correct? You're pretty active over there, actually, aren't you?
No, I'm not. No, actually, that's the funny thing. I'm not on X at all. There's somebody who set up an X account which forwards my stuff.
Oh, really?
And so so I have no idea. I have no idea who's doing it. I hope that it's not being funded by USAID or something like that.
Well, that is. Well, they're doing a hell of a job. I got to tell you.
I know. So somebody's working their buns off, and since I have I stay off social media mostly. Yeah.
So are they? This is intriguing. Are they taking excerpts from your blog and putting, because it sounds like it's written in your voice and everything?
Oh yeah, no. What they're doing is taking materials from my blog and my Dreamwidth journal, and then also comments, because on my blog I try to respond to everyone's comments.
Mm-hmm.
I moderate them strictly. I have a courtesy policy. If somebody wades on being a typical internet jerk, the door will hit their rump on the way out. Every comment passes through moderation before anyone else sees it. So I feed. The joke is that I have a pet black hole named Fido, and I feed trolls to Fido the black hole burp on a regular basis. But the upside for that is that it's actually this sort of ongoing conversation with me and my various readers and my readers among themselves and so on.
Yeah.
And so so I'm constantly making comments, and the X person is constantly pulling things out of that.
Well, they're representing you well in your work.
I'm glad
I'll say
to hear
that.
It's one of those odd things that I would be very interested to find out someday who's doing it and whether somebody's paying for it.
Well, John Michael Greer, thank you, sir, for the discussion, and we just can't wait to have you back on. I just really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me on. I always like being on podcasts.
Yeah.
It's always entertaining, and it's free advertising for my books, which I do not object to.
Well, I've read several of your books, so I highly recommend them. And anyway, I will put the links on. If you'll hang on just for a second, sir, while I kind of close out. Hey, guys, I'll put the link in the show notes but you need to check out John Michael Greer. He's got a lot of great things that he writes about that's well researched and very reasonable in an age where common sense and reason's not so common. So anyway, thanks again to our esteemed guests, and I'm Mark signing off, telling you guys to stay sharp and keep it Pearl Snap.